Hey, kiddos. Today we'll be talking about the elements of a scientific poll, how it affects politics, how it affects policy, all that stuff. What makes a good poll? Pretty much everything that a politician does is done in result of or after a poll is given. So let's break down the elements. Let's get through this as quick as we can so you're not sitting here watching me for 10 minutes. So, how do politicians know what a public opinion is, how people believe, which way they want to vote, how politicians are doing a good job? Well, use public opinion polls. Let's move this out of the way so you can see. See, public opinion polls. Um, so, what are they? They're basically it's a method of scientifically trying to figure out what people are thinking at any given time. These are usually snapshots in time and not necessarily a long trend. When you have a whole lot of polls put together, that's when you start finding trends. You can start graphing it and finding it, all that stuff. That's when you usually see like approval ratings for certain policies or politicians. Those all happen because of opinion polls. Not moving. There we go. Can public opinion polls weaken a democracy? If I was talking to you in person, we'd have a good conversation. But ultimately, the answer is yes. You can say that, yeah, public opinion polls are pure democracy because you and I are what democracy is supposed to be based off of, but we don't have a democracy. We have a democratic republic, which means we vote for people to make policy. They're supposed to be more intelligent, I guess, or more informed than we are. The big problem is that oftentimes those of us who are polled are just don't know the information enough. Not everyone is a policy wonk, or they don't have CNN or Fox News or MSNBC on their television 24/7. But as you can see, this guy is an idiot because he clearly is wearing a Cardinals shirt, and you can't really trust people who like the Cardinals. So you can see he's a clearly uninformed voter. So when a senator or a representative or a president gets these numbers back about a policy that could be detrimental to the United States, they might go along with what the poll says because they want to get reelected. And this is the dangerous part of opinion polls, where you have uninformed voters influencing policy, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So, what are the types of opinion? We're going to talk about a couple of types of opinion. The first one is consensus opinion. It's a general agreement among the citizenry on an issue. So, if you can say school shootings, a very large majority of Americans are going to say that school shootings are bad. Kicking puppies, another one is a consensus opinion about people kicking puppies. It's a bad thing. Don't do it. So, that's a consensus opinion. A divisive opinion would be something where public opinion is polarized between two different positions. So as you can see on here, over here, it's pro-life and pro-choice. It's about 50-50. We have a lot more divisive opinions today than we had even 10 years ago. Right now, Trump is underneath an impeachment inquiry, and that's about 50% in favor of it, 50% not in favor of it. So that is a divisive opinion in the United States. So how did opinion polls even start? Washington didn't have them. Founding fathers didn't have these things. So who started with it? Well, in the 1930s, these two groups, Gallup and Roper, they started to scientifically ask people what they thought about certain policies, and they would give that information to policymakers, aka bureaucrats and politicians, and they would try to make opinion or make policy based on that. So whenever you hear about the worst approval rating in history or the best approval rating in history or what have you, it goes back to like the 1930s. Before that, we really don't have any data. Yeah. So there are methods that are still used today based off of Gallup and Roper, and there's three factors that you put into account. These are the most important factors. How random the sampling is. This is the most important thing. You have to make sure that it's a random sampling. If you're trying to figure out how well a presidential candidate is going to be, you probably don't want to get 1,500 people from only California because it's not a very random sampling of people. So you want it random as possible. The sample size, you want at least about 1,500. Pollsters found out that 1,500 is pretty standard. You don't get much more accurate after 1,500 people, and that's for a population the size of Plainfield or a population the size of the United States. As long as you have a random sampling of people with a good amount of variation, which you can't really see down there in the population, 1,500 is usually pretty good. There's also another one you should think about too, which is not on here, which is the types of questions being asked. Are they leading questions? Do they make the person who is being polled think a certain way? Like you want to be as objective as possible to get an accurate poll, because remember it's scientific. You don't want bias in there. So how does Gallup and Roper do it? Because they're not one company. They call households, not cell phones, to choose their participants. The reason why this is an important thing is because your cell phones are tied to you, and no matter where you move, and we're a much more transient population. Landlines, on the other hand, house phones, by the way, are linked to a house, so you know certain locations. You know exactly what geographic location you're worried about, which is really important for polling because certain policies do better in certain areas than other areas. Gun control does better in places like Chicago than it does in Montana. This is becoming much less accurate because less and less people have house phones. I don't have a house phone in my house. My wife and I both have cell phones, and we're pretty successful professionals. And we just don't have landlines anymore. Here's a list of the most trusted pollsters, or the bell. Most trusted pollsters. If you actually click on this thing on there, this picture, you go to a link to 538's most trusted polls. You have Marist College, Monmouth University, ABC News, so on and so forth. They give A ratings and all that, but they tell you how biased they are. So the more blue over here, up there, the more blue, the more Democrat they are. The more red, the more Republican they are. But yeah, so this will come in handy in a day or so, or today when you're actually using polls to try to answer some questions. So this is a good resource. Oh, I clicked on it. That wasn't a good thing to do. So it works. All right. Okay. So go back. So when assessing public opinion polls, you should ask yourself a number of questions. You should ask yourself about 8 questions. First off, identify the subject of the poll. What's the poll even about? The poll on the side here, underneath me, is official presidential job performance survey put on by Trump-Pence 2020 campaign. Identify the source of the poll. We found the source. Sometimes it's Fox, sometimes it's ABC, sometimes it's Quinnipiac. Determine the sampling method. So how are they doing it? Are they calling phones? Are they calling cell phones? Is it an online poll like the one that's on this page? Each one has a certain degree of accuracy. Like for example, if you do house phones, chances are it's going to be a more conservative poll because older people tend to have house phones opposed to younger people, and older people tend to be more conservative. So you get the idea. Identify the sampling size. Is it at least 1,500 people or close to it? Consider the margin of error. Usually polls which have a margin of error of about 3% plus or minus are considered accurate. So if you see a poll where a politician's leading another politician by 2%, essentially that's a toss-up because there's always going to be some sort of error. Examine the wording of the question. So the one underneath me, you can see how would you rate the president's job performance so far? And you examine the answer categories: great, good, okay, or other. There's no other option for like a negative response. If you opt other, you have to write it out. It's a pretty biased poll, essentially. And evaluate the results. So what are the results on there? That's what you should do. All right, those are the steps of evaluating a poll. Hi again, kiddos. So the last video went long. That's why it was an abrupt stop. However, this is only going to be like a 4-minute video to finish up the rest of the slides. And like I said, it's like 5 slides left. So let's just finish or start going with this. You just saw about how a proper poll is supposed to work, the 3 different categories, what you should look for if you're trying to find a poll that's accurate. But every single poll, no matter how accurate it is, there's going to be some sort of sampling error. This is the difference between what the sample results say and what it would say if you asked every single person the same question. Now, the only way to get rid of the sampling error is poll everyone, which isn't going to happen. So we accept a certain amount of polling error for a proper poll. Usually it's plus or minus 3%. So if a candidate is winning in the opinion polls prior to an election by, let's say, 51 to 50%, to their opponent, it's basically a toss-up. We don't really know who is going to win because, again, the sample size could mean that the president or whoever is up by 4 points or down by 2. It's a swing of plus or minus 3 points. Again, this is something we have to accept in all polls, but something we kind of deal with. So anyway, exit polls are another type of poll that we should know about. Exit polls are polls where people are talked to after they walk out from the polling place, and we basically ask them how they voted. These are somewhat reliable. Some people don't like being asked what they vote, and sometimes they would lie to them and tell them the wrong answer. I know, believe it or not, politics people could lie, but this is why, like during election cycles or election days, you can see the results coming in before the polls are closed. It's through exit polling. All right. Push polls are another type of poll that you should know about. Push polls are opinion polls where respondents are given misleading information about a candidate in order to make that candidate look really bad. It's essentially libel or slander. A good example would be if I asked you, would you be more or less likely to vote for Dick Durbin if you found out that on Sundays he runs a puppy mill and then he uses those puppies to make sausages for orphans? You would probably be like, whoa, what? Does he do that? I don't think I'd really like this guy. Those are illegal because again, it's libel or slander. However, it could be hard to prove. But yeah, that's an obviously extreme example of a push poll. But that's exactly what a push poll is. They basically make you dislike the person that you're asking the poll about. It's not meant about getting an opinion. It's meant to hurt the image of the other person. There's a couple of polling disasters. We talked about sampling error. There's a couple of issues in the past. So, 1936, Literary Digest thought FDR was going to lose this election to Republican Alf Landon because they used the phone books and motor vehicle records to find respondents. So what, right? It was they thought it was a random sampling of people. They used more than 1,500 people. There was probably variance in there. Well, the problem was it wasn't that random because in the 1930s, the kind of people that had phones and had cars were rich. And in the 1930s, rich people were not super big fans of FDR. They thought he was a traitor to their class, if you will, to get kind of communist on you there. But yeah, so they didn't like him. So Literary Digest thought that FDR was going to lose in a landslide in 1936. Turns out, as you can see from the video, or the map here, he won everything but Vermont and Maine. So it was a pretty big win. And as you can see, Hawaii and Alaska weren't states, and DC didn't have any votes yet. Another one, 1948, should probably move. I am not Truman. You should probably move on. 1948, the Chicago Tribune ran with the story, Dewey defeats Truman, because they used telephone polls to see how people would vote. And again, in 1948, the wealthy were the ones that had designated phone lines. Usually people had what's called party lines, where they would actually share phone lines with like their neighbors. It was kind of weird. So rich people didn't think that Truman was going to win. He was unpopular generally, and he actually won in a landslide as well. So the Chicago Tribune screwed up. Their second biggest mistake was buying the Cubs, because for the first 20 years of my life, they were kind of a laughing stock, and it was all because of the Tribune. So I sort of hate them. You may notice that I didn't mention 2016. Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to beat Donald Trump, and the polls said that Hillary Clinton was going to get way more votes than Donald Trump. The reason why that's not a polling disaster is because the polls were right. Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by over 3 million votes, or maybe just under 3 million votes. So there's a sampling error you can deal with. But she won the popular vote. Just that obviously Donald Trump won where it counted. He won by just under 80,000 votes spread across 3 major swing states. So that was not a polling disaster. That's it. Thanks for listening, kiddos. And now you guys can go on and work on whatever you have to work on. Bye.